And thank you, Terry, for starting the recording. So we have two presenters, Andreanne, who's with us, and Kim Lundgren, who's also with us here. Thank you both for making time to be here with us and share your expertise. And I'm going to quickly, I'll stop share and I'll quickly introduce them, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So Andreanne has over 5 years of experience as a health equity and community resilience consultant at ACBC Consulting. Andreanne has worked with clients such as the Medford Board of Health on Medford Resilience Hubs and the Mystic Valley Public Health Coalition on diversity, equity, and inclusion planning. Andreanne is also a doctoral researcher at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and holds an MSc in Public Health from London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. So what's particularly interesting to me about both of our presenters is this next line I'm going to read from Andreanne's bio, and you'll see that the same kind of combined expertise Kim also brings to the table. So Andreanne marries academic knowledge with staunch commitments to amplifying the voices of marginalized community members and centering lived expertise. Now, when I look at Kim's bios, I'm going to read that line that strikes a very similar chord. Kim promotes comprehensive approach to sustainable planning that encourages equitable stakeholder engagement. So this is key for us. We're all here to do sustainability work, regenerative work, and climate resilience and adaptation mitigation and all of that. Great stuff that needs to be done. But how do we do that with equity in mind? So these two presenters are particularly interesting to me because they bring both of these expertise. Kim is the Chief Executive Officer of Kim Lundgren Associates, KLA, a woman-owned benefit corporation that delivers solutions to create sustainable communities by addressing climate change. Kim has over 20 years of professional experience working with local governments to design, secure funding for, important skill, by the way, implement and evaluate sustainable plans and programs focused on climate change adaptation and mitigation. As an early municipal sustainability pioneer, Kim developed the first climate action plan in Massachusetts and one of the first municipal climate adaptation plans in the country. So there's a lot more to say about Kim. I'm just going to say that there has been a focus on innovation in her work, and I'm really looking forward to listen to both of our presenters, Kim and Andreanne. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that introduction. And I know I speak for Andreanne and myself to just thank you all so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here with you today. Today, you're mostly going to be hearing from Andreanne about some of the great work that they're doing there in Medford. I'm going to give you all kind of a overview of thinking about how we got to this place. Because as was noted, hopefully I'm older than I look. But I did start doing this work 20 years ago, actually in the city of Medford. So I'm happy to join back up with my starting city. And certainly Krista knows and some others. It was really interesting. I mean, literally, it was 2001 when the city hired me to write a climate action plan. And I didn't know what a climate action plan was, but neither did they. So we ended up figuring it out together. And it's really interesting because things were very, very different then. We weren't going to the community asking for folks to engage because most people didn't even know what we were talking about. We barely knew what we were talking about. And so it was very much developed in a bubble, right? Working with an energy team. Maybe we had some folks from utilities and stuff, but it was very much an internally focused plan. And so, now that I've had the privilege of being in this field for so long, you can really take that time and start reflecting back. And so, would I ever suggest any of my clients do it that way today? No, of course not. Absolutely not. But as we start looking back, I would say it was about maybe 15 years ago when we really started realizing, like, we probably need to talk to others about this. We probably should get the community engaged in this conversation, especially because as these years went on, we weren't really seeing that many impacts 20 years ago, but they started coming more and more and more. And so like, okay, you know what? We need to start doing more equitable engagement. We need to go where they are. How many of you would say that? Oh, let's go where they are, the people, right? And for a lot of people, that literally just meant physically. Let's physically go where they are. Let's not ask them to come to City Hall. We're going to go where they are. And then what happened when we got there? They didn't care what we were talking about. They didn't know what we were talking about. And we weren't talking to them appropriately. We came in thinking, why aren't you concerned about climate change? It's the biggest threat to our planet. When in actuality, unfortunately, a lot of our community members don't have the luxury of thinking about climate change, right? So there's all these learning processes that we had along the way. I'm sorry, I don't have time to think about climate change. I'm trying to put food on the table for my children, or I need to pay the rent or the mortgage. I have these other stressors in my life that are making it really challenging for me to think about that. And so as planners and climate experts, we had to think back, okay, now how do we address this? How do we adjust? How can we connect? But more importantly, how can we reach that sustainable future if we have folks that are struggling to put food on the table? If we have folks that don't feel safe having their kids walk to school? We can't have that sustainable future like that. And so one of the things that I am most proud of about this field is the evolution that we have come through here, this big pivot that I would say is like the last 5 to 8 years, and it's really huge now. And that really is the opportunity to leverage a climate action planning process to address and put a spotlight on these chronic stressors in our communities. That's not something we used to be able to do. And it's very unique now, right? So when we're talking about a sustainable future, we're not talking about just environmental sustainability. We need to recognize that all of these things come together. And if we're not addressing chronic stressors, whether they be financial, environmental, social, health related, then we will not get to that sustainable future. We cannot have a sustainable future if we don't address climate change, but we cannot have it if we have anyone that's not able to be prosperous, to support their families, right? Some of the basic things, all of these things have to come together. And so, in my 20 years, and I will say in some of my recent years, I actually was fortunate just over the last year and a half. I'm part of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I'm sure a number of you are as well. I sit on the Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Board or Committee, and I helped us put together our JEDI statement for this year. That process was really important to me. So one of the suggestions I'm going to put out there for you all is just constantly educating yourself, always finding opportunities to improve yourself. Sure, I've been doing this work for 20 years, but if I just think what we did 20 years ago is the way to go, how would we ever solve this crisis, right? Even those of us that have been here a long time have to continue to enhance and improve our own skills and knowledge. And for me, one of the biggest things that I've learned the last few years is around the language and the framing that we're using. And these definitions and a lot of the stuff that was put up earlier that you've all seen in these Google Docs is a fantastic way to get that started. I started really getting connected to asset framing. Are folks familiar with that term? Asset framing is defining communities by their aspirations and their contributions, rather than just going straight to focusing on their deficits. So what do I mean by that? So when we talk about the community members that we went to them, right? And I said they didn't have the luxury of worrying about climate change because they had to put food on the table for their children. A lot of times we think about those folks as vulnerable. They're vulnerable community members. Like, well, are they? Or have they been put in that situation by systems and infrastructure and structural racism and things of that sort, right? So when we immediately use our language and refer to them as vulnerable, we are setting them back. Words matter, right? And we may not even mean it, but we have to be rethinking it. And I'm gonna throw up in the chat when I'm done before Andreanne goes on a few links and you can check out some of these things. But starting with educating yourself and getting your language and terminology down is essential. It really is an important part to start the right conversation. Other things that are so important, listening. I know it sounds so obvious, but really listening. And don't go in, even if you're there to talk about climate change or to introduce the topic of climate change. You have to first listen to what are those challenges for folks to get to that place. I'm going to see if I can throw up this quick image. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the International Association of Public Participation Professionals, Public Participation Spectrum. I mean, it is like a tongue twister to say it, but I'm going to share it quick. Are you seeing it here? So a lot of times when we are trying to engage folks, right, we always say, oh, we want to get to this collaborate and empower. This is where people are really going to engage and they're going to be taking ownership over this, right? And they'll drive their own activity. Yeah, that's great. We do want to get there. But in most of our climate action planning processes, we have to start here in the inform and consult phase. And that's why understanding and being really articulate about and intentional about the language we're using to engage folks here is really important, right? Because what we want to do is we want to come into a community, we want to get them really thinking about the potential impacts of climate change and their opportunities to reduce their contributions to it, while recognizing they probably haven't had the luxury of worrying about it. And so how do we want to get to this place? Well, first we have to help them make some connections, right? Building trust. Building trust needs to be a foundation of your climate action planning process to get to equitable outcomes. But be real with yourself. You cannot build trust overnight, and you're not going to build it over a 10 or 18-month planning process either. But you can sow the seeds. You can start building on it and working with it. Use it. If you're using a consultant for your planning process, help them start building the seeds. But you, if you're the community or the representative of the local government, you need to help move those relationships forward as well. And you need to be acting with intention. If you are engaging folks for your planning process, that shouldn't be the only reason, right? It can't just be, well, we need to hear your voices. No, what we need to do is help you better be equipped to deal with this. And if that means we have to address some of these chronic stressors, then that's what that means. And it's really important that we understand that. So recognize that in a typical 10 to 18 month planning process, it can be nearly impossible to move down this spectrum if you're starting here. But if you keep moving it and keep going as you're implementing your planning, moving along, you have more opportunities to get there. And the way to do it, building trust. So the way that I do it in my organization is we try to find community-based organizations on the ground. Equity partners, folks that are already working with these communities. Why? Number one, they already have trust with the communities, right? I'm not going to come in as a consultant and pretend that I can build trust that fast. Number two, they can represent that group of individuals or community members and help us as the team trying to push climate action understand what their needs and priorities are beyond climate change. So we can get a lot of information from a really well thought out group, right? We have to think about things, me as a consultant, I have to think about things, how can I get this done as fast and efficient as possible and still get those outcomes we're looking for? And that's where the equity partners are so key. But the big thing with it is that we, as much as we can, try to put them on the consulting team whenever possible. It's not always possible to connect with another organization that fast. So sometimes we add them as paid, consultants or support to the team once we've gotten started. But you have to pay these community-based organizations, and you have to pay them fairly. Pay them at the appropriate living wages and beyond is what it should be. I don't want to go into too much because I know Andreanne has stuff that's really similar there that I don't want to touch on. I think those are the biggest things. And so recognizing that if you're working with these key equity partners, first off, train them, build their capacity. What we try to do is align missions. One really great example I have, a community that we worked in was literally, I reached out to this organization that worked with seniors to help keep them in their homes, right? Maybe their spouses had passed away, they were alone. And I reached out to this woman who's the executive director of this organization wanting to talk about climate change. And she just said, I don't know why you think that this would have anything to do with what I do. And I'm like, really? I'm like, you are aware that seniors living by themselves are the #1 group that unfortunately are found dead in their homes after an extreme event because a lot of them don't call for help. And she was just completely blown away, right? Total light bulb went off, right? So how we are reaching out to us, if I had just sent a random mass email to a bunch of groups, I would have never had the chance to reach out to that woman. I contacted her directly, and I did actually pick up a phone and called her. A lot of these CBOs, they don't want to be text messaged or emailed. They want to have that interaction. So phone call, in-person meetings when they're safe, things like that to make that connection. This woman, seeing her light bulb go off was the most amazing thing, and recognize like, oh my God, I do have to help protect my members that I'm working with. And so I bring up these examples because it actually is, believe it or not, I am getting into that resilience hubs piece. Because when we're thinking about how do we continue to engage folks, empower them, we want to hear about their aspirations and contributions. How are we helping them think about climate change? That is where resilience hubs can be such an amazing, I don't want to say product, but it is an outcome that brings multiple benefits, right? So if you're thinking about a community that needs a community center, needs places for kids to go after school, needs healthcare, needs professional development training, right? Any of those things, or it's just a playground for the neighborhood kids, right? A place that they feel comfortable with. One of the things people need to remember is that our emergency services in all of our communities, none of them, there is literally no community in the world whose emergency services can take care of every single citizen in that community. And it's not even remotely close. It's more than 90% of people have to be prepared to shelter on their own and take care of themselves. Emergency responders have to focus on those community members that really cannot take care of themselves, maybe have health issues. If the power goes out, for example, those that are on oxygen, they're going to be a top priority, right? So we have to recognize that we are all meant to have to be able to take care of ourselves. And so what are we doing to help folks do that? The resilience hubs allow us to create a space, one that people are comfortable with, because its primary purpose isn't necessarily to go somewhere in the event of a disaster, like we have our emergency shelters, right? A lot of our schools have emergency shelters. It's a scary situation. Now you're asking people to go to a place they may never have been before. How that's calming, that's keeping people calm and ready to go, right? So there's a lot of things we need to think about. We can improve our communities, we can bring folks together, build trust, and build that resilience if they're able to go someplace they can walk to that they recognize. And so I'm going to stop there because I could really talk about this stuff forever, but I would like for Andreanne to now share some of the work that her and her colleagues have been doing in the city of Medford, really focusing in on trying to build up opportunities in Medford to create really resilience hubs by looking through this public health lens.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you. And so, yeah, I just wanted to start before I share my screen and share all the slides that I prepared, of really like why we were looking to this resilience hub in the first place. It didn't really come out of climate or environment, to be completely honest. It actually came from working with the public health department and the community development department and realizing we don't have a front door. We don't have a front door for services. They're sort of separated and all over our city, and they're not well connected. And a lot of the services are actually outside of Medford. So with that said, it's what do we do about that? How do we make it so that we can best organize and centralize our services so people can reliably know where to get information and where to get help? And that was sort of at the same time I, on my own, was sort of looking around. I got interested in resilience hubs. I was reading up more on the climate side because that's where my public health interests lie. And I sort of was in these meetings about how are we supposed to support our residents day to day. And I thought, you know, these resilience hubs serve sort of multi-purpose. They are both a community center that is meant to support programming that residents need and want, but also have that added benefit of being a place for climate resilience specifically, of having, you know, a physically resilient structure, of having resilient communications. There's a lot in the background going on to support residents in emergencies, which again do overlap with public health in a lot of ways, because You know, a lot of emergency managers are also housed in public health departments, at least Medford's is. So thinking about, you know, heat waves, thinking about flooding, our health department has to work with our Department of Public Works to figure out how we're going to protect people and how are we going to protect our infrastructure. So with that said, I will share my little presentation here. And sort of skip over this intro slide. I realize you can't click the link, so it's, but I will send that out afterwards. So here is sort of this graphic that our lovely graphic designer helped us create, thinking about the physical impact of climate change to the public health impact. And you know, I think many of you here are aware of the many different public health impacts to climate change related to heat and the stress on food systems, the stress on our bodies, floods, and the ways that that impacts our drinking water, or how that might impact the ways that our vector-borne diseases might relate, storms and actual physical infrastructure damage that, you know, you could be injured during or injured in the aftermath. And of course, then other pollutants and other, you know, climate change and air pollutants, they're concentrating airborne allergens, they're worsening respiratory illness like asthma and COPD. And of course, you know, it's written very small, but it is very important, is also the mental health toll of all of these impacts. I mean, we can definitely see that even with COVID, of the mental health toll of emergencies. But, you know, how does an engineering department look at these problems and respond versus how does a public health department look at these issues and respond? And, you know, I think that for so long, a lot of the emphasis has been on, if we strengthen our roads, if we strengthen our buildings, our people will be safe. But ultimately, I think that that's not always true. We can see in a lot of ways that we have infrastructure that doesn't protect everyone. We have healthcare infrastructure, but not everyone is protected. And so how do we, as a public health department, think about our people and protect people when it comes to those emergencies? So the question that public health is sort of asking is, how do we support our residents' health and well-being during, but also before and after emergencies, which translated in a more climate specific way is, how do we support our residents' adaptive capacity? So this project, and again, prefacing that this was completed in June 2020, and we're now in a second round of funding continuing this project. But that will be, you know, leading to the lessons learned at the end and sort of where we're at with the equity piece. But this original project was between January and June of 2020. So we did have a very short timeline, but we wanted it to be equity focused. And at the time, our two main equity priorities were around distributional equity and procedural equity. We wanted to know, where was there a lack of services? Where were areas that were least served? And how could we best, you know, fill that gap? And we also wanted to know, how do we involve community in that process of determining, if we were to have a resilience hub, what do you want in it? What would you want in it? What do you want for yourself just on a day-to-day? We didn't even get too much into climate because we understood that it takes time to talk about these new concepts, you know, talking about climate adaptivity. If you start off with that, people say, what? Like, what are you talking about? And so sort of starting at the baseline of, how do you need to be supported on a day-to-day? And then leading down the line in the conversation, sort of such that if an emergency were to come, how are you best prepared? So that was sort of the framing of this project. And then the third piece was, how are we going to begin to build this up? Which I'll get in a little bit more detail. So what we learned was, we did this service audit, so to speak, of what existed in Medford in terms of community resources and services, and where they clustered, what kinds of services were they, and then and overlaid by environmental justice criteria. And what we saw or learned was similar to what we had suspected, but at least we could see it laid out, was that areas of 1.1 and 7.2, which 1.1 being, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Medford neighborhoods, but 1.1 is Glenwood and 7.2 is Wellington, so it's a lot more industrial. And then South Medford in particular had fewer services, especially community resource related services, and had much higher, were much higher in their categories of environmental justice criteria. So in a prior climate vulnerability assessment, these areas were also identified as high climate sensitivity or risk. And ultimately, this overlap of all these conditions were such that these residents have a higher average of a reduced adaptive capacity from income, or, as Kim mentioned, structural inequities towards BIPOC. One thing that was important to mention is we were talking about vulnerability constantly. We said climate vulnerability, vulnerable residents. That word vulnerable was something that kept coming up, and we had residents say, I'm not vulnerable, I'm marginalized. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because this is like sort of the product of why we would categorize someone as vulnerable, is this process of marginalization. So that was really important to hear as we're going out to the community asking about climate vulnerability, right? We also spoke with our organizations. We wanted to understand, if we were to rely on our CBOs, our community-based organizations, where are they in that process such that we could partner? And I won't get into too many of the details here because I do have limited time, but one really important piece, at least for a city planning perspective, is that all of these organizations shared that they are actually looking to our local governments to provide climate and emergency preparedness policy and legislation and planning such that these organizations can best respond or support. And I've seen this come up a lot because now we're in our next phase of this grant. We've created a community provider coalition to support the planning process, but there's this unspoken hesitancy or tension, so to speak, where these providers are sort of looking to the city to take lead or take charge, but the city's hoping that actually the opposite, that this is going to be run by our organizations. And so I think it's important maybe to have that conversation before you're halfway through planning like we are, to really lay down, like, what are our expectations here of each other? Who's going to be leading this work, and who should be responsible or accountable at the end of the day for this work to be done? That was a quick lesson learned of being halfway through planning with our coalitions, and hearing that, we should have just looked back at this report. They're looking to us, and we need to find that balance between giving our organizations a very strong voice and collaboration, but they don't want to be leading this work, at least not the 12 to 15 organizations that we spoke with. We also spoke with them about resilience hubs a bit to understand, if we were to partner with them in a space like this, what do they want that space to look like? And they, across the board, had very similar themes, which is encouraging, because at least you don't have to match disparate interests. But they were interested in creating a multi-use gathering center where we're building in social connection. They wanted a space for community engagement where we can organize with our community more readily, more easily. They wanted a communication center or centralized space where information is easily accessible for them, as well as providers, to know what they might refer to their clients, or how they might support their clients with a partner organization that they might be able to work with. And lastly, that they were hoping that they could have a collaborative response with regional efforts, that they hope that it doesn't rely all on Medford one day, of course, but that this network of support is extended throughout the region. And so then we spoke with residents, specifically our community members, and this was done through both a mix of surveys and Zoom conversations, as our graphic designer represented here. And very similarly, there are very similar themes around needing or wanting to build these social networks, of building social connectedness, and not just being involved or asked to participate, but that they feel that they are truly welcomed and that they belong in that space, especially when historically our participation has been fairly individual representation based, which can make people feel tokenized. It can make people feel that they're just there because they're the community member checkbox, they're the BIPOC checkbox, or whatever it may be at that time that's important to include XYZ people, that it just becomes a checkbox. And so avoiding tokenism or creating colorblind spaces where we're not addressing race or we're not addressing class in these very particularly like racist and classist dynamics of who's able to adapt and who's not. Again, the information access and needing to address our communication, as in the city's communication, and information barriers, these English only or internet, I'll post it on the website, I'll post it on social media. It sort of creates this exclusion by default. You're not purposely excluding someone, but it excludes people because that's your default mode. And the need to then think about, cities are always thinking, what's the easiest and most widespread thing we could do, where we do one effort and it reaches the most people, or maybe 2, but they don't want to do 5 or 10 because that adds more work. But what is the goal here? Is the goal to reach our community members, or is it to do less work? I think that there is obviously a healthy balance there, but I think that balance then sort of leans towards needing to add on more diverse methods of communication, that you're not just thinking about internet, or you're not just thinking about language, but one thing that we got brought up recently in hiring our new community liaisons is the need for maybe auditory information, that there's a place on the website to share that where something is read rather than, or like read out loud for audio rather than read visually, especially for the Haitian community in Medford, where literacy is also associated with other class dynamics. So, and also just to point out, this transactional relationships was also something that got brought up as a very critical barrier to be engaged in community practices or community processes, because they didn't see that their role was, again, to be belonged to or welcomed in a group of planning, but rather, I bring you here for this particular reason and then off you go. So the last piece, of course, is then we were trying to identify sites that might potentially house these programs and needs. And we wanted it, again, back to the distributional equity piece, we wanted it to align with the priority areas that we had identified. And Kim's team helped us enormously with creating this list and identifying spaces. And even within this identification, it was difficult to find things in more industrial areas like Wellington and Precinct 7-2 or Glenwood 1-1, that we're still obviously trying to find the best site. And again, these things take time, but this is a really good start to know what exists, what might we be able to work with, and how do we address that there may not be many sites in these areas, specifically because there haven't been resources there, et cetera. And with the information from our conversations with organizations and with community members, we, with Kim's team, created a site evaluation checklist, so to speak, where it's integrating the needs and interests for in the future when the time may come where a resilience hub is being created, is we have a minimum criteria of things that this space needs to include. So I'll just end with our lessons learned, so to speak, and where we saw this project go, because when you write a grant like this, I was also very new and I was very excited. It was a 6-month grant. You can't build that trust, especially when it has been broken so many times over time. I thinking like, we'll create trust and it'll be great. In 6 months, it'll be perfect, and it's not that people shot down the idea, like, what is this? I don't want this. It was more like, that sounds nice, but it sounds pie in the sky. It sounds like, promises you can't keep. It just sounds like more of the same. And so they were very skeptical of how reliable community engagement would be with follow-up, with really meeting the promises that this was supposed to be community-driven or community-led. And they questioned for whom these hubs would truly serve, like who was our target audience? We had an organization that asked, like, will unhoused people be welcome? Will people with substance use disorder be welcome? There are a lot of questions around who do we mean when we say everyone? And I think that's something that has come up a lot in these kinds of spaces. And so what we realized is we actually need to take a step back. We needed to pause rather than move forward with this hub and create it and get it all set up and be like, we did it. We needed to press pause and we needed to slow down and really invest time in building that trust and really creating stronger partnerships where they're more reliable, where you understand that you have the same values and you're on the same page, and that community members feel like we're building that space for them, that it's ultimately spaces of planning are for them. Designing is for, like, they are the designers, they are the planners, they are the implementers, and they are the evaluators, that this is theirs and not the city telling them that this is what's best for them. So, our biggest lesson learned is, like, we need to slow down. And ultimately that we've been hearing time and time again, we need to invest time and money, not just time, to build this trust at each step of the way. Some quotes that I pulled actually from notes that I had from meetings that I had this past 2 weeks. One of them is, our community should be in control of these timelines, that we determine when trust has been met, not your funder deadlines. Another one, when we were planning about how we're going to engage community and talk about their policy interests, someone said, don't ask me to share my trauma. Ask me what I think of things and what I've learned from my journey. That they're there to share their knowledge, their lessons learned, and their wisdom, but not trauma. We're not here to have a group therapy session or a session where someone feels like they have to expose themselves to feel like they have something worthy to share. And lastly, someone said, our input should be valued in the same way as a consultant. Why are we expected to volunteer our services or receive $25 gift cards for our expertise? So those quotes might help with our equity discussion, but I will leave that there and hand it back over.
Thank you, Andreanne, for sharing people's quotes directly. And that was very helpful to learn, not just that part, but the entire presentation. And thank you, Kim, as well. There have been a number of questions, and while I have you, Andreanne, on the screen, there is a specific one